Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Thursday, April 14th, 2022, and today we're going to be talking about the state of Georgia and President Trump making an endorsement for David Perdue just a few months ago, and now coming to a point where David Perdue really isn't going too far against Brian Kemp here in the Republican primary. In another poll that was released just today, we are starting to see a very consistent result from the state of Georgia. That result being that Brian Kemp maintains his lead in the Republican primary for the Georgia gubernatorial race. If you take a look at a lot of these polls, the averages are somewhere hovering around 10%, and it makes sense. Quinnipiac University in their January poll had Brian Kemp up by 7. The Trafalgar Group had him up by 9. Fox 5 had him up by 9. Fox News had him up by 11. The University of Georgia had him up by 11. And now The Hill and Emerson College have released a poll that show Brian Kemp up by, get this, 11 percentage points. Now, the interesting thing about this is that the race started out immediately following President Trump's endorsement, showing that there was a tie. Fox 5/Insider Advantage went to the voters and pretty much informed them of this decision that President Trump had made, and they showed that there was a tie between the two candidates. Later down the line, about 2 months later, you found that Brian Kemp maintained a 9-point lead, contrary to the tie that he found from the same pollster just prior to. I think, looking at these numbers, what we find ourselves are a lead for Brian Kemp and nothing really going against that. Brian Kemp has maintained this lead despite President Trump really trying to get David Perdue elected, and even in his own interview says that David Perdue is a long shot candidate. Now, this isn't exactly how I think President Trump expected this race to go. The race in 2018 was decided a lot more favorably for those who were endorsed by the former president. And obviously it mattered a lot more when he was president of the United States, when there was a very clear indication that he was going to be running for re-election, and some of these people would have future political aspirations and knew clinging close to President Trump would be something that benefited them. But I will also say that he still remains with heavy levels of influence throughout the GOP, but maybe not to the extent that we think. David Perdue now not even coming close to a point where he's closing the gap. In fact, you're starting to see it expanding between Brian Kemp and himself. You start to question, did President Trump's endorsement even do anything for David Perdue? And I would argue that it did. I think without President Trump sort of solidifying and saying, I will endorse you should you choose to run, I don't even think David Perdue would be in this race. It is very weird to see that when looking back at the governor election results from 2018, seeing that Brian Kemp won in a national environment where Democrats were up by 9, where you had Stacey Abrams, who was, hailed as this chieftain for the Democratic Party, winning them a presidential election in Georgia, winning them 2 Senate elections through her voting initiatives. Despite all of that, she lost in 2018 in a year environment that should have been very favorable towards her. Yes, the margin was 1.4%, and I think that there is a lot, that has changed between Georgia then and Georgia now. But I will say that Brian Kemp did prove his worth back in 2018, and in polls seems to continue proving his worth amongst the general electorate about what would happen come the November election between David Perdue being a potential nominee and Brian Kemp, of course, being his own nominee. But as an incumbent, you are almost always secured a spot in the nomination process. You are almost always going to be fine when it comes down to a brand new nominee replacing you on the ballot. And I think Brian Kemp is no different. But what was going to happen, I think what the Republican Party, at least on the Trump side, expected to happen, was that Brian Kemp was going to lose heavy amounts of support simply because President Trump endorsed David Perdue. Well, as you see from this CNN Politics article saying that Trump can't get his Georgia allies to back David Perdue for governor, you start to see where the concerns come in. I think the Republican Party here isn't exactly going to move away from from Brian Kemp simply because President Trump told them to. I think, what we find is that Donald Trump does sway a significant portion of the electorate, but you're not talking about 80 to 90% of voters here. In fact, in some cases, based off of what we see, isn't even talking about 2/3 of the Republican Party electorate. While Donald Trump individually is popular, that doesn't exactly mean that voters are always going to back his preferred nominee. His endorsement can only go so far. He truly is the one with the name recognition, and David Perdue doesn't exactly offer the same type of Trump appeal, especially after losing the Georgia runoff election. I would also like to say that, before we get into President Trump's endorsement being more so ineffective, we do have to recognize that there are voters out there that know that this doesn't make sense politically speaking. 2021 was a year where the Republican Party more than likely should have won this Georgia runoff election, both of them. What we were looking at was the Democratic Party won control of the House, the Democratic Party won control of the White House, and there was a remaining chamber that could exist to temper a Democratic president or temper a Democratic House or potentially both. But voters in Georgia rejected David Perdue being reelected and rejected Kelly Loeffler from winning her election as well. Raphael Warnock won by 2, and Jon Ossoff won by 1.2. Now, it was very interesting to see that David Perdue ended up coming up short when it came down to the Senate election in the state of Georgia. When you look at the election results that coincided with the presidential election, what you found was that David Perdue, being a Republican, was at 49.7%. Jon Ossoff was hovering in the 47s, which meant that you were talking about a 2 to 3 point difference between the combined and total Democratic vote versus the combined and total Republican vote in this Senate jungle primary. And then when you hit the runoff election, you find that David Perdue actually underperforms his 2020 margin, at least combined margin with some of the more straggler candidates when it came down to the GOP. What I find from this is that David Perdue ended up underperforming significantly relative to 2014, but actually underperforming his 2020 November election result, when voters turned out in mass levels, when Joe Biden was winning by 0.2 across the state of Georgia. Yet you fast forward to a January election where we know how the presidential election is going to go. We know how the House elections have gone. The only thing in contention right now is the Senate, and yet President Trump, while despite heavily being there, can't even cross David Perdue across the finish line then. It's very seemingly clear that it's becoming increasingly clear that the voters in Georgia are recognizing that a loss to Jon Ossoff probably should have been the final straw, and that he will not serve in this governor mansion capacity, or at least in terms of a candidate standpoint, as someone who adds to the Republican Party's advantage, as someone who is able to do well in terms of electability. Because while Brian Kemp and David Perdue may seemingly be at odds when it comes down to the Republican primary here, the general election polls are very, very clear. The candidates that performed the best against Stacey Abrams in the most recent poll is Brian Kemp. Brian Kemp wins by 6. In the poll against David Perdue, Stacey Abrams wins by 1. What you're finding is that another poll, Emerson College, Brian Kemp wins by 8. David Perdue only wins by 5. There is a real possibility that we end up in a position where voters here are, going to be backing either candidate. The Republicans are going to win regardless, and that's just a question for the national environment, and I do think that it is, at least partially true. But I also do think that there can't really be any risks taken by the GOP. I think if you're talking about electability and talking about the argument that makes the most sense, well, nominating David Perdue probably isn't the most sensible decision for the GOP. At the end of the day, one is consistently polling better than the other, and in the Republican primary. I mean, President Trump's endorsement is a huge thing, but the fact that Georgia voters are rejecting such an endorsement, in essence supporting Brian Kemp, is very telling. I think I find a lot of information from this, telling me that, Brian Kemp is maintaining this 9.7% on average lead, which means that he probably doesn't have as much to worry about as Casey Cagle did in 2018 when he saw the Trump endorsement. And that 2018 point is exactly what I'm going to point you to. Looking at the election in which Brian Kemp was elected to the governor's mansion in the state of Georgia, you saw him defeat Stacey Abrams. But his pathway to there wasn't exactly as clear as you might think. Brian Kemp ran as the Secretary of State of Georgia, and he was also a candidate for Agriculture Commissioner back in 2006. Lost. He ran against the Lieutenant Governor of the state of Georgia. Nathan Deal was the governor at the time. Now, Casey Cagle came in with endorsements from Nathan Deal. I mean, you're talking about the person he works close with Saxby Chambliss. You're talking about multiple U.S. representatives, multiple state senators and state representatives. When you take a look at those who endorsed Brian Kemp in the first round, you didn't have anybody else. But when you take a look at the results here, what you will find is that Casey Cagle got nearly 40% of the vote, whereas Brian Kemp only got around 26%. Hunter Hill was at 18 percentage points, so it was practically a second-place race, whereas Casey Cagle really took away from the rest of the pack. The polling numbers had indicated that it was, at an odds point, but Casey Cagle was the presumptive nominee from the very beginning. He was quite literally the lieutenant governor of the state of Georgia. Yet here's what happened. Because neither candidate could reach 50%, it advanced to a runoff election on July 2018. Now, Casey Cagle started out with some leads. He was at 46 to 45, 52 to 42, 48 to 41, 44 to 43, and then a tie. But the thing that happened that really changed this trajectory of the race was President Trump's endorsement and Vice President Mike Pence traveling down to campaign for Brian Kemp in the Republican primary. So what happened? The inevitable result was that the Republican Party, backing Brian Kemp in essence, ended up winning. Brian Kemp won with 69.45% of the vote in the Georgia Republican primary, which meant that Casey Cagle actually underperformed his first round votes. Whereas Brian Kemp gained about, let's say here, about 250,000 voters, Casey Cagle actually saw a deduction of nearly 50,000 voters in the primary, all because President Trump's endorsement swayed voters in a particular direction. And the same thing could happen now that we're looking at Georgia's election with David Perdue, but I'm not as confident because the data told it all back then as well. And I think what we would be finding is that it wouldn't necessarily just be, the word of mouth about David Perdue being electable. It would be opinion polling data telling us this as well. You can gauge very, very, very significant shifts when it comes down to who people support and what they support in terms of opinion polls. Now that we see that Brian Kemp has been leading by 7, 9, 9, 9, 11, 11, 11 consistently, we find ourselves in a position where we have to take a look and say, we trust this data and we think this data is accurate. And if there was numbers that showed that David Perdue had actually made major inroads against Brian Kemp simply because of the Trump endorsement, that would be newsworthy as well. But that's simply not what we're seeing. I think we're starting to see a decrease in effort and, the amount of which candidates actually dedicate to this Trump endorsement, because it doesn't seem to be something that is an assurance in a lot of ways. I think it really does help. I think David Perdue is back on the map simply because of the Trump endorsement, but I do want to say that part of me believes that this endorsement really doesn't mean as much as we sort of let it on to think. We see this endorsement as the end-all be-all when it comes down to the Republican primaries, and I think in many cases that is, simply just fact. I think, Trump's endorsement is a huge player when it comes down to what he would say, rhino endorsements or pro, MAGA endorsements. But I think when you're looking at David Perdue, people can't really see much of a difference between David Perdue and Brian Kemp. And Brian Kemp is the name that they know and that President Trump had endorsed in the past. It's really hard for President Trump to try to walk back on that Brian Kemp endorsement from 4 years ago when the tweet has been screenshotted and utilized in campaigns and, been weaponized in a sense against the Democratic Party. And now all of a sudden he's switching bases. I think David Perdue could very well win the governor election in 2022. I think he could both win the primary and the general election. But there's no guarantee he even makes it through that primary process. If I was in this position looking at the Georgia gubernatorial race, I would want to be Brian Kemp more than I would want to be David Perdue. He's coming back as this rerun candidate who lost in the past that is now deciding that he wants to run for governor, but it honestly isn't a good look. He's not exactly super popular, and voters rejected him very, very recently. The good thing for David Perdue is that 6 years from now, he might be able to run. People have a very bad memory when it comes down to American politics, so it's completely plausible. But I will say that right now, I don't think is, the time. And I don't think he really has much time left either. I think David Perdue very much needs to withdraw himself from politics and move on with his life, because he doesn't have any openings. John Ossoff or whatever Republican, ends up defeating him in 2026. That's going to be a question then. And you're probably not going to see David Perdue run there. We already know Herschel Walker is going to be the Republican nominee for Senate in 2022, which means that the next opening for David Perdue, even if the Republicans win the Senate election, will be 2028. So you're not exactly talking about some types of elections in which you find David Perdue, finding a way in. There really isn't anything left for him. He could potentially go into statewide office, maybe as Secretary of State or Commissioner of Agriculture, but obviously this is not what he wants. He wants to be governor or he wants to be senator, and I think he wants to be both, but knows he has to choose. And right now what he is choosing is to attack against an incumbent who remained, at least somewhat in terms of level of popularity, that remains high in name recognition. And despite President Trump being so heavily on his side, isn't getting that bump that he needs. The numbers are clear. Poll after poll after poll, Trump endorsement or not, right now Brian Kemp is in the lead. And he has maintained that lead every single time. I do want to see what happens as we go through the further months and see, what changes dramatically between now and then in terms of the primary season here, in terms of who drops out, who enters back in. But I think, right now you're going to see a two-way race between Brian Kemp and David Perdue, and I think we should 100% be expecting that, but I don't think we should be expecting a David Perdue victory, because right now it doesn't look like Trump's endorsement did much for David Perdue in the sense of winning him the overall Republican primary. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 governor election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.